Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy. And today we're going to talk about how two things can be true at the same time.
This is not two kinds of people. This is not two is better than one. This is two things can be true at the same time.
This is like the opposite. We spend so much time on this podcast doing the very important work of deciding who's the
right.
monster.
Yes.
Right? Who's the bad person, who's the good person. And the
It's
good
often
person
me.
is where we're listening to this podcast
Yes.
right now. But I've been working on this. I've been finding this very useful. And so I thought it would be good to do an episode on like what this means and how you can apply it to your relationship and to your parenting and sort of, make your life a little more conflict free or at least conflict aware.
Yeah, and it fits into so many categories. It fits into spouses, which we talk a lot. It fits into spouses, which we talk a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
It fits into relationships with our children, and let's just say maybe some of our teenagers who we're having this problem with. I feel like this is my Achilles heel, my kryptonite. You've kind of tried to talk me off this ledge, but it's difficult. I am a person who cannot rest until someone has heard me and agreed that they are wrong and I'm right. It just plagues me.
And I think for me, it's a little bit different. I mean, certainly that, but sometimes it's also, we can't stop arguing until you see, not that you're wrong, but that I'm right and a good person, right? Like, not that like you must slink away in shame, but you must say like, okay, I see you and you're a good person. Like we have to keep the argument going until I make you understand I'm not the monster.
Yeah, and I want you to see that you're a bad person.
You are the monster.
Which means
right.
you're probably a better person than I am. But I'm like, I can't rest. I mean, I can think of one person right now, and it's the 4 a.m. plague that we walked away from our relationship, and they think that they were a good person in my life and that I was an ingrate. And I'm like, I resist the urge to get up at 4 a.m. and write an email that's like, you were a bad person and I didn't appreciate you. Why? Because you were bad.
Yeah. It's taken me a long time to figure this out, that you can have somebody out there who has a different point of view on something. And that is the conclusion, that two things can be true.
Oh,
but I'm telling you, it helps. It helps sometimes. It helps kind of.
Goodness knows I need the help, Amy.
And again, it's like, it's my favorite thing. We're not saying do this so that you're a better person. We're saying do this because it'll help you be happier.
Sleep at night?
Yeah,
I could use a little more rest at 4 a.m. rather than fighting with my nemesis who only exists in my brain.
Right. Okay.
This person has no idea they're my nemesis. None.
This episode is for you, then. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm going to do a whole other 12-part podcast called Me and My Nemesis.
So in a disagreement, two things can feel like they're opposites, but it can still be a fact that both things are true. So examples. I came up with a couple of examples here for everybody. I'm angry at you for how you spoke to me, and you're angry at me that I'm not listening to you. Those, like, you're both mad and you're both right. Like, you can both be mad about the thing you're mad about.
Yeah, this is me and my teenager 24 hours a day.
You're mad that I won't let you go to the party and you're not going to the party. Like, those two things can definitely both be true.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
and they
seem very close together.
Right. Well, the argument doesn't have to keep going until either you talk me into letting you go to the party or I talk you into not being mad that I won't let you go to the party. Those are two things that can both be true. They're not even opposites.
They're not opposites. They're not even opposites.
Right.
We're
not going to.
They're parallel lines. Yeah.
Yes. There are things. So when you're in this thing, right, each party in this disagreement thinks you're right and the other person's wrong. And we want to get past that. Would you like to hear about why this is? Because, of course, I've done the research.
Yes, I think I do want to hear about why this is.
There's reasons that this occurs. Okay, so we talk sometimes in the show about how the human brain loves narrative, loves an explanation.
Yes.
Right? And so beware of the story you tell yourself, because it's just that thing your brain does. Your brain loves a story, and when it doesn't know the story, it'll make one up. that seems like it makes sense, and then it'll collect information that fits that narrative.
Right.
So this is kind of like a corollary to that, which is that the human brain categorizes. It also loves categorizes. This is this kind of thing. This is that kind of thing. That as we walk around the world, our brain puts everything into categories so that we can, survive. This is a safe berry. This isn't. Berries that look like this are safe. Animals that look like that aren't. Snakes
Sharp,
that have
bitey
yellow
teeth,
on them.
bad.
Yeah. What's the snake thing? It's like, if it's yellow, it's a great fellow. But if this is wrong, don't live by this. It's like, if it's red, you're definitely dead. Like
this is not a snake advice podcast. Rule. In case you accidentally tuned in for snake advice,
that could be
you're in the wrong place. I could now, if my
what
13-year-old was available, we would know everything possible to know about snakes. But he's not here, right?
But like, it's a category, right? They walk around like that's a good kind of wave and that's a riptide, whatever. Right. Like we categorize things as we go. And so then we have a tendency to over dichotomize things.
Over dichotomize, do we?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I mean, agree. And that teams, right? That like we are on this team or that team, and that there are signifiers to our team that are important. And then we kind of lose sight of what team we're on. And suddenly we're like, wait a minute. I was just studying fascism last night with one of my children. And it's very interesting, like how nationalism throughout history, the idea that like national pride and identifying as a part of a nation plays a tremendous role in like societal stability. That like when we identify, and that a lot of rebellions and unification movements fail because that sense of nationalism is missing. So for example, if you were trying to unify the United States and we were originally all the different countries, like if we identify so strongly as New Yorkers that we don't identify as members of the United States, like you can't unify a country if people feel too strongly about their local identities. You need a national identity, which helps bring people together. But then nationalism quite quickly tips into like fascism and craziness, and
we're right and everybody else is bad and wrong.
Like nationalism tends to go badly at a certain point, but it is also very necessary to form people together in positive ways. So all of these things are double-sided, right? Like the ability to identify and be on teams has a lot of positives and then quickly tips into like genocide. And you're like, wait a minute, what happened? We were just at like, we're all going to agree on something.
It's like this lizard brain thing that when you're right, you're safe. Yes. And when you're wrong, you're in danger, right?
And when your group is right together,
then you're really safe.
Right. But then, and like when you're leader, I mean, this is the thing of like, oh, I would never join a cult. It's like, well, you're part of some cultish things, right? We're going to talk to Amanda Montell on the podcast. You wrote that book,
gosh,
Cultish. Cannot wait. We're like what we live for. But right. You and then, strong leaders tend to come along and be like, not only are we part of this group, but these other people are trying to ruin our group. And this kind of thinking is so human. And I don't think we think we do it, but we all do.
We all do it. So there's a psychological term for it. It's called dialectic. I mean, I've heard the word dialectic.
So have I.
A lot.
I don't know what it means.
Exactly. Guess what it means? It means two things can be true. Like that's literally what it means.
Dia, two.
Yeah.
Lectic something
is
else.
Talking about something.
Okay.
I think. So it's two things can be true. That's what
Dialogue is two people talking.
There you go. So it's really all it means is this idea. And it's been around since people were in togas talking about this. But Hegel, who was a philosopher in the early 1800s, he, I guess, is who really that this idea has been. He brought it into a modern thinking. So he talked about this dialectic, and he said that every thesis, every statement, like I don't have a good example, so I'm going to watch me crash and burn here. But like every statement, like March is never nice. It's always rainy and cold in March still. Has within it an antithesis, except the years where it's not, where it's actually sunny and warm or it snows or whatever.
You came up with a good example.
Every proposition has within it contradictory elements.
Sure.
Every thesis has an antithesis right in it.
Right.
And when you consider both the thing and the opposite thing that can also be true, that's when you reach synthesis. And that's what you're going for. Like,
right.
when you consider this and this, then the third thing is created, and that's synthesis, and that's usually what's right, I guess.
There used to be a card game. Tell me if you remember it. I feel you will. It was black and white, I feel like. And it was just questions in a box. And you would ask the questions, and they were like, they made you think. It was like a discussion kind of a game. I'm going to say this was late 80s, 90s. I'm going to look it up during the break. I
remember this game. Okay.
Was it called? It wasn't called Dilemmas. It was something like that, though. Tip of my tongue. Anyway, one of them was, would you have an invention that will change the world for the better in a lot of ways, but it will kill, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people.
Is it a nuclear bomb?
Would you invent
a nuclear
this
bomb?
thing?
Yeah.
And it was like, we were like, of course not. Like, why would you invent blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, it turns out it's the car, right? Like, it changes everything about how you do everything, but it kills thousands of people a year. And that's right. That's the thesis and the antithesis. Like, a car is a good invention, and it kills thousands of people a year.
Right.
So you got to be able to think both of those things at the same time. Like, there is no such thing as, would you want this event? Because you're thinking it's a bomb, right? Like, well, we don't need bombs. We need hugs. Like, no, we need cars, but also there's huge downsides to them in that they're possibly murdering the planet and they're killing a lot of people.
So that's it. Like, and you don't really understand what a car is until you've synthesized the good things about it and the bad things about it. When you've put all of that together, that's how you really come to an understanding.
Yeah, and I will say I have a child who struggles with what we call black and white thinking. And
he likes it, struggles in that it's awesome, and that's how he likes to do things.
Struggles in that his black and white thinking drives me insane and makes me want to put him on the lawn with a free child sign attached to his head. That, like, everything is this way. This is going to be terrible, or this, he just struggles a lot in that area, and it makes me crazy. And we end up in dialogues where I'm like, it's not true. Like, my life is literally this child. We were recently on vacation at a very well-known theme park that is expensive and extremely fun. And it started raining, and this child loudly announced, "There is no God." It was like,
because I'm at the park.
Because, like, 3 drops of rain meant that everything was completely ruined. And I just was like, and we were able to laugh about it later in the day. That, like, do we need to go from, like, it's either drizzling and there is no God, or, like, we can carve out a pretty fun day. Like, there's a whole world between these two ideas, but this child does not excel in being able to hold these ideas simultaneously.
You have to start with the acceptance, right?
Yes.
The acceptance that it's raining on my dream vacation. And then this, like, third thing can be created. This is what I like about this. Like, you're on your way to something better. And we're going to talk about it in the next part when we talk about our relationships. This is not about, like, just don't let it bother you. Like, so what do you have a disagreement?
That's where I end up.
Like, who cares? Who cares? It doesn't matter. Maybe you just shouldn't let it bother you. It's not really about that. It's about getting to this, like, we're on our vacation and it's raining. So then this 2 things can be true. And then there's this third thing, which is we're going to go into, I don't know, the Hall of Presidents because it's raining, and it ends up being your kid's favorite thing you did that day.
Yeah.
Like, change is possible when you accept the 2 things. I mean, I'm still, like, grappling with this idea, but let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about how you can apply this, like, in fights with your partner, because I think it's very helpful.
Perfect. And just before we break, I have to tell you that I barely listened to anything you said in the last 2 minutes because I was Googling Scruples is the name of the game. Scruples. All right. We'll come right back.
Okay. So 2 things can be true. And for me, and probably for a lot of people, it's with my partner, with my spouse, where this is the most challenging and potentially the most useful. So
hit me.
We'll start with how this plays out, right? So you're in a disagreement, and you're both mad. Like, you're both like, well, you didn't tell me that you were going you didn't tell me you're going out to dinner, and now I've made dinner already, and you never tell me. You just make plans. Let's say I'm mad about that. And let's
say, Amy, yes.
I
could tell by the way you delivered that's not it.
It's something that definitely could happen. Let's put it that way. And then your partner is like, I do everything right most of the time. Like, why are you so hard on me in little things? Okay. You're both mad about those things.
Yes.
And I, in this situation, I'm like, I have to stay mad until you realize this is a big deal and I'm sorry. And the other person on the other side is like, I have to push back and make you realize that things aren't as big a deal as you make them sometimes.
Right.
That is the perfect situation where like both of you could be right. Like maybe I do overthink things sometimes, and maybe my partner does need to give me more of a heads up and more consideration when plans change. Both of those things can be true, but when you're stuck in it, you're mad, you feel right because you are right, but you feel like if you try to see things from their perspective, it means you change into being.
Well, right. That's the key. And I mean, I think this is really true with like resentments and grudges, right? That like I've devoted, 10 years of my life to hating my ex who cheated on me. And then if I ever smile at him at a party, it's like I've undone 10 years of hard work of making him know how bad he is as a person. And it is the classic, like, drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. Like, it doesn't actually work, but it is, I think, when we talk about, like, place of maximum generosity, it plays into the fallacy that you can convince. My best friend gave me this advice 30 years ago, and I've said it on the podcast before, that I was talking about this boss that I had who was like good looking and young. It was like an internet startup. He was like that guy, like the Happening New York, like Mr. Big from Sex and the City type of guy, although like younger. And he was so awful. And to me, he was just a terrible person. And I would just lay in bed at night thinking about how terrible he was. And he was just like a finger gunny, like everybody's favorite guy. And it just ate me with acid that people thought he was good when I knew he was bad. And my best friend at some point, after I'm sure like our 90th trip to the bar, where I was like, and then he did this and he's this and he's such a phony. And she was like, it's not your job to convince people that they're jerks. She did not use the word jerks. And it's not your job even to convince other people that certain people are jerks. You can just know that they're a jerk and then go about your life. And I was like, wait, this is a radical idea. How could this possibly exist? And it's still not something I'm good at. Like it drives me crazy when people, I have a righteous anger towards people who I think need to be shown up for their wrongness.
But it's a whole other thing. When it's like that dude at the bar, he's annoying, right? That's one thing. But when it's the person you live with,
or your boss, like who does have like an all day, every day, like determination of your existence.
Right. I think there's a slight difference between like that thing is not your problem from like this definitely is your problem, and you have a right to be mad about it.
Yeah.
And we're not saying like just try not being mad about it. We're not saying that. We're saying that like this is a situation you have to resolve. And you can either fight until you don't feel like fighting anymore and then stay mad for 2 more weeks and then, reach a sort of detente where you forget what it was you were mad about.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe in this moment you can be like, I hear what you're saying, but you understand that you know what I mean? Like you can
I think there's two different things.
I see what you're saying here.
There's one element, which I'm talking about, which is this can't be fixed, which is like you see yourself as phenomenal. I hate you. This can't be fixed. Like, I'm never going to convince you that you're terrible. We don't get along. We have to figure out how to like coexist in a space.
That might be like with an in-law.
I was going to say, this is a classic example of people with their in-laws.
Your annoying brother, whatever. Yeah.
There's a second example, which is that we have a great deal of respect and love between the two of us, but we see certain things from very different lenses, and we have to figure out mutual ground that we can exist on. And so example one, and I think that they're both valid to the conversation, like example one might be an in-law who you didn't choose, We're not talking about our own in-laws, who we've said many times that we love and respect.
Right.
But
present company excluded.
Maybe there's in-law who like you didn't choose, you don't like their personality, but you have to spend time with them. They're a member of your family. They're not toxic. They're not like, okay, we got to go no contact so they stop ruining our lives. They're just an annoyance. So that's one version of their truth, and your truth can still be true, and you can just exist side by side. But the truths that are like your child or your husband or your spouse or someone, or you and I, like a relationship where you're really trying to make it work, that takes probably a little bit more work than like,
Right.
I'm going to ignore my in-laws' helpful suggestions, even though they drive me crazy. And at night when I get in bed with my husband, I'm going to be like, oh my God, that drove me crazy.
Right. This is different, a little bit different, I think, from like, we don't talk about foreign affairs because we are just never going to agree, and that's okay. Like, I don't need to. It's easier sometimes to change the mind of your taxi driver than it is, your cousin. So leaving that aside, this is like this is a conflict that you're in, and it's affecting you, and you have to do something about it. And it's not as easy as like leave the room when the election comes up, right? This is like I have to fix this. That there is this, it's a third way process. That's not my term. It's a therapeutic term. And that is, instead of like, we stay in this until you're right, you admit that I'm right, or I admit that you're right, or we just like run out of steam, that there is this third way where you start with acknowledging the validity of the other person's position, which is at best, at least very disarming, right? Like if I'm like, you never tell me when you just make plans and you don't tell me. It's like, why do you make such a big deal about it? I'm like, you're right. I am angry about it. You're right. It really upsets me. And I should think about, why that is, because I could just put this food away. But I'm feeling angry about it. Like, that's very different than because you're so inconsiderate and you always have been, right? Instead of like, let me show you how more right I am to come at it, to try to see it from the other person's point of view. And it doesn't mean that makes you wrong.
I also think that this can be valid in both of the examples that we're talking about. I was just talking with an old friend who I was catching up with about a situation that like we haven't talked in 10 years, and she had a very high conflict relationship with one of her family members. And I picked up with like, oh, how's it going? And it was pretty much the same stuff was going on. Now it was lawsuits. I mean, it had gotten escalated and gotten really, really difficult. And we were talking about the dropping the rope concept. Like, is there a point at which you give in, and like, can you maintain your own truths while giving in and walking away to stop the tug of war, basically? And I think that in conflict situations, more like the in-law situation, that it is, I mean, the psychologists say this all the time. There's a line of books about it. It's a dance. It's a dance of conflict, right? And that this disarming and this way of saying like, you know what, you're right. I am holding on to some things that are difficult for me for a host of different reasons. Mm-hmm. It is a form of dropping the rope to say, I do have a role in this, and I will look at it, and it helps, I think, everybody in this situation maybe put their guns down a little bit.
Yeah, it occurred to me as you were saying that it's not saying, okay, I won't be angry. It's saying, you're right, I am angry. It is really triggering me, isn't it? I mean, I can tell. It's not denying your feelings; it's owning them.
Yeah, and I just was having this situation with my kids this morning, trying to get out. We were traveling, so we're a little bit jet lagged, and like trying to get out in the morning is difficult. And I had just been doing an interview yesterday about kind of like meeting your kids where they are. And I was like, I'm very understanding of this and knowing the reasons. And I was like totally in that mode. And then, we woke up at 6:45 to get out the door at 7:45. And I was like, I know it's hard because we're super tired. We're all jet lagged. Like, I was meeting them in the space. I was doing all the good work, Amy. And then by the last 5 minutes, I was just screaming it off and being like, we have to go, And I think, excuse me. Bless you. And I do think that I was trying to say, guys, I want to operate for this commerce space, but the closer we get to the deadline, the more kind of shrill I get and trying to say, because then it always ends up with, oh, you're always yelling. No, no, no. For 45 minutes, I really was not yelling. I was being very loving. I listened to an interview yesterday and I was trying that. But at a certain point, and possibly it's because historically, like, I haven't done it that way. And I get that there's a lot of reasons behind it. But I do think that when you start with, here's why this is hard for me, here's what I'm bringing to it, here's what I'm hearing, it can be helpful.
I mean, and maybe not when you're 5 minutes late for school, right? Like, I think that there is, I don't want it to sound like, and then you have to always, I know exactly what you mean, to be like, but I didn't yell for 15 minutes and then I yelled. It's like, wah, 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 all the way back down to 0 for you. And it doesn't matter that you did the other good stuff first. Yes, it does. And there are times when this, gentle parenting, I'm open to hearing what you're saying, and there are 2 ways to do this. And like there's times when you're going to be more available for this than others, maybe. But part of this dialectic thing that I'd always heard, and I never really knew what it was. I just knew it was like a term that psychologists used, is this DBT. So there's dialectical behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is like, if you're afraid of flying, we're going to, like, it's sort of exposure therapy. Let's talk about it, right? Let's do the things, let's expose you to it to change your behavior. And dialectical behavior therapy, I never really understood what it was. I still don't. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist.
Or a snake expert.
I may just re-underline that.
Got a lot of
flaws. But it is the dialect, the D in DBT stands for this, like, 2 things can be true thing. Like, that's at the center of it. And one of the most basic things that they have you do in this kind of work is not use the word but anymore, to use the word and. For example, like, my spouse is mad at me that sometimes I forget to tell them that I have a work dinner, but it's not like I'm a bad guy, and then just like, can you just replace that but with and? My spouse is mad that that I'm sometimes not around for dinner and I forgot to tell them, and I'm not a bad guy. Like that it just starts to change your wiring of like, 2 things can be true. You aren't a bad guy, and you were maybe inconsiderate in this one moment. Those are not contradictory. They only felt like they were.
This is like Dr. Becky, who we've had on the podcast and hosts Good Inside. It's the idea that, like, seeing children as essentially good, like, what is getting in the way of you being good, like changing your starting point, I think. And man, I think this is where we get in a lot of trouble with, like, parents and in-laws. And we talked about this on the Mom Blame episode, like, when you start with a thesis, like, my mother is overly involved and constantly harping on me. Like, there's nowhere to go in that dialogue, basically. And it's not that it's not one of the truths, but also, like, my mother might also have dedicated her whole life to making sure that I was happy and well cared for. And even starting with the idea that there can be multiple truths, I think frees us up in ways that we don't always imagine.
Yeah. All right. I was going to talk about Dr. Becky too. Let's talk about her and kids and how we apply this to parenting after this. So before the break, you were talking about Dr. Becky Kennedy, who I did think of because I knew that I had along the way maybe heard her say this. So she did this Instagram post. I'll put the link in the show notes, where she brought up this 2 things are true, she called it, and how you apply it to your children, how you can push back with firmness and connection at the same time. Like, she's kind of saying you can be 2 things at once, firm and connected, when you give your kids this response of 2 things can be true. And it's basically, I'm using one of her examples here, iPad time is over. And it totally makes sense you feel upset about it, because when I put my screens down, it's hard for me too.
Right.
That's giving them the 2 things can be true. And she goes back. She does it for, like, here's how you do this with a toddler. Here's how you do it with a teenager. But 2 things can be true. You validate, you state your boundary. You validate their reaction to that boundary. You understand that they're upset, that you're not letting them go to the party where there won't be any parents.
Right.
You understand.
And it can work the opposite way, which is I love you and I really need you to leave me alone for the next hour because I'm having a mental problem right now. Like it can definitely be. I feel like this is later stage marriage and in a good way for me. Like I feel like in the beginning of a relationship, you're very like, I love you and I will show it to you in the correct love language. And, it's The Bachelor. Like, I will express my feelings. I will take you on a hot tub ride in a balloon. Like, and that later love is, I love you and I'm really looking forward to being away from you for a week with my girlfriends. Or I love you and I need you to stop telling me this story because I've either heard it before or it's just essentially boring. Like it works both ways.
This reminds me of Gwen Lathland, whose Mama Cusses is going to be our Fresh Take guest this week.
Great.
Just 2 more days. And she talks about responsive parenting. She doesn't see, you'll have to hear more about this in the episode, but she's a gentle parent, but she's like, but I'm not gentle. That doesn't feel like the right, that's the word for the kind of parenting I ascribe to, but I'm definitely not gentle. So she calls it responsive parenting. And I think it's kind of what all this is about. Like, if I take in, I take away my kid's iPad because she got a C in a test, right? And she's so mad at me. And you make room for that boundary and her feelings about it. Instead of, you may not speak to me that way, or like you may not slam your door or whatever. It's responding. It's allowing room for both of those things to exist rather than like shutting it down.
Right.
And
it's okay to be frustrated, but it's not okay to punch me in the face.
No, right, exactly. Yeah. Right.
That's right.
But her being mad at you is something that you maybe just have to let happen, and it might be there for a day, and you might be mad at her, like, oh my God, like I told you 18 times if you didn't get that math grade up, the first thing we were going to do is take away the iPad, and then it happens, and now she's mad at you as if you hadn't been extremely clear about that when she was not studying for the math test. I'm making this example up, but like your resentment towards each other doesn't have to be solved first before the vocal disagreement can end.
Right. And this is also something that is a huge practice. And for kids with ADHD, kids on the spectrum, kids with developmental delays, this is an area of weakness a lot of times for kids because the idea that it's my birthday and it's raining are like... and therefore everything's ruined. I'm trying to think of a better example, which is like, it's like throwing everything out because of one circumstance and being, and trying to work towards the thing of dad's away and that is making you anxious and upset. And we can still get through the day and have a decent time. That for a lot of kids, for all little kids, that can be really challenging. And for some kids, as they grow up, that two parts of the mind, the two things can be true, is actually like blocked in their mind. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
It does. Or like they come to their first breakup and they might be like, I need to understand why this happened in a way that seems sufficient to me before I can move on, right? Like that's a breakup is the perfect example of two things can be true. You want to be in the relationship, the other person doesn't, and the reason they gave you might not make sense to you or be sufficient, but it still exists.
Or even you want to be in the relationship, but you want to break up with the person. Like those two things can be true. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you get into that very black and white thinking, that heroes and villains, and we say it all the time on the podcast, which is like change your story, that I do think that the root of human happiness kind of lies in this skill, which is, and I think it's a kind of thinking that I'm very prone to and that I will start to see people including my spouse, my siblings, my parents, in-laws, whatever it might happen to be. It's like heroes or villains, heroes or villains. Like this person is a good person or a bad person. They're a mean person or they're a good person. Like that I tend to categorize people. And I think we've talked about it with having a child who's like, this child is a picky eater. This child is my problem child, my difficult child. This child is my good child. Doesn't give me that. All things could be true at once is sort of challenging too. And I think, in our politics these days, we certainly see it where there are complicated stories all around the world that are going on, and that it is hard to boil down heroes and villains in some of these stories, and that nobody is all good white hat team good, and nobody is all bad black hat team terrible. That getting at gray is just hard for us as people. And I think it is the root of conflict, both for, ourselves within our families and ourselves as humans on the global sphere.
And our kids are growing up in an age of a lot of information overload, right? And then also disinformation. And you are right, we are right, and the other people are super, super wrong. Like they're being fed that every time they open their phones. We're all being fed that. And
for sure. And I do think it's developmentally appropriate. My husband was just kind of calling me out because I tend to be a little bit like, it's time for a lesson. And, this one is saying, oh, I hate this, coach, and they stink and they're dumb and bad and mean. And I'm like, well, think of it from their point of view, though. Like they've got a lot of kids who they're trying to play, and it's not always time to see it from everybody's point of view. But I think giving voice constantly to, if I was listening to them describe this situation, what would it sound like? Just trying to give voice to ourselves and our kids of, is there another point of view? And don't do this when we're in red brain, because I know from my husband's point of view, sometimes my husband so is this person, and sometimes I literally have to hold myself back from striking him when he's like, well, but when you think about it, I'm like, no. We're right now bashing on that person and supporting me. We are not devil's advocate right now. We are not we're not seeing it from their point of view. We're seeing it from my point of view, and they're a dummy, and someone needs to go kick their butt for me.
But there's two steps, right? The first one is there are allowed to be 2 points of view.
Yes.
Like I think what comes before the when you think about it, first, they are allowed to have a different experience than you. Their feelings are valid. That they have valid feelings doesn't mean your feelings are invalid. There are 2 different sets of feelings that can both be valid is the first step, right? And then I think it's a lot more advanced to be like, what? There's a point that even though we talk every day, that's not enough, and I need to be talking to them twice a day.
Right. And that seems to me very clear as we wrap up our conversation, to be like red light, yellow light, green light. In terms of like red light, I can see you're super frustrated. Yellow light, okay, there are 2 sides to this, 2 points of view. Like, let's look at the whole picture. And green light is like, let's have a philosophical conversation about how no one is fully good or bad, and that people contain multitudes.
Right. And that's pretty advanced, but this is a good place to start, though. You will fight less. Conflicts will be shorter and more productive when you don't need to have a winner.
I'm still working on this one, Amy. I'm going to say solved it, but
too.
Man, this is my Achilles heel. I have trouble. We're both like Irish grudge ladies. Like I have trouble walking away and not being like coming back in and being like, one more thing though.
Well, this is my motivation. I found a quote for this. It was like, well, this is perfect motivation for me because I love to be smart. I love to learn things and be smart. F. Scott Fitzgerald said,
who I'm obsessed with.
He said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. So if you do that, you're really smart, F. Scott Fitzgerald said. So that's enough for me.
Yeah, it's the
you know how it goes when I get there.
Gosh, we'll link to the poem "Good Bones" by Maggie Smith, and it is this beautiful poem that sums this up, and it's It's about looking at it like I'm selling the world to my kids, like any good realtor, looking at a real crappy place and saying, you could make this place beautiful. And it's like, it's a terrible place, but you're just, it's the opposing points of view.
Thank you to everybody who has checked where they're listening right now in their podcast apps to make sure you're still following and subscribing the show. Apple Podcast did this big update, and they changed and turned off a lot of auto updates. So even if you subscribed at some point in the past, if you haven't followed our show recently from wherever you listen, it might be turned off, and it would really help us if you turn it back on.
Only one thing is true. We are getting hosted by the new podcast updates,
Yes,
and you
as
need
is
to
every
go back
podcast.
and resubscribe to the show
Right.
because otherwise you're not getting it. We're following off your feeds. Tell your friends, hey, have you listened to What Fresh Hell lately? I used to love that show. What happened? Well, your phone stopped serving it to you. That's what happened. So go back, tell a friend, like, follow, subscribe, and then you can always find us in your feed.
Yeah, and there will be.
Episodes and episodes to come. Thanks for listening, friends. And with that, we will talk to you next time.
So long.